What if I told you the United States once planned to burn Japan to the ground not with bombs dropped from planes, but with bats? Real, living bats, each one carrying an incendiary device strapped to its chest. This is not science fiction. This is Project X-ray, a top-secret U.S. military program launched in 1942. The idea: drop thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats over Japanese cities at dawn. As the bats searched for shelter, they'd roost inside the eaves and attics of Japan's densely packed wooden buildings, then, one by one, detonate. It sounds insane. But for a moment in World War II, it was deadly serious. This plan was signed off by generals, backed by scientists, funded by millions, and it very nearly made it to deployment. But what happened next was so ridiculous, so disastrous, and so literally explosive that the program went up in flames before ever crossing the Pacific. This video will reveal how America tried to weaponize nature and how one test turned into a fiery nightmare that even the military couldn't believe. January 1942. Just weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was reeling. The Pacific War had begun with a sucker punch, and the pressure to strike back fast and hard was mounting. But how Japan was thousands of miles away, fortified across islands and oceans. The military was open to anything, even the unthinkable. Enter Lytle S. Adams, a Pennsylvania dentist, amateur inventor, and personal friend of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. While vacationing in Carlsbad Caverns, Adams observed thousands of bats swirling overhead and had a thought no one else dared to speak aloud. What if we turned them into bombs? His proposal was wild. Attach tiny incendiary devices to bats, load them into canisters, drop them over Japanese cities, and let them do what bats do best: find shelter. Japanese architecture, largely constructed from wood and paper, made their cities especially vulnerable to fire. Adams believed the bats would crawl into attics, eaves, and barns, where the delayed fuse charges would ignite, triggering thousands of simultaneous fires across civilian and industrial areas. Adams pitched the idea directly to the White House. And instead of being laughed out of the room, he was fast-tracked. President Roosevelt passed the concept to the U.S. Army Air Forces, which saw unexpected promise in the bizarre plan. The project was quickly codenamed X-ray and placed under military supervision. The idea reached the desks of top brass at Wright Field and later, Dugway Proving Ground. Even Dr. Louis Fieser, the chemist who invented napalm, joined the project to help develop lightweight incendiary devices small enough for a bat to carry, but still hot enough to set a building ablaze. On paper, Project X-ray sounded ingenious: a low-cost, low-altitude weapon requiring no pilots, no radar, and no fuel, just instinct, gravity, and a match. But no one thought to ask the obvious question: would the bats actually do what they were supposed to? Because nature doesn't take orders. And soon, the project's biggest fire would happen on American soil, lit by the very weapons meant for Tokyo. The blueprint for Project X-ray read like something from a comic book. Thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats, small, lightweight, and capable of carrying more than their body weight in flight, would be captured, placed into refrigerated hibernation, and loaded into bomb-shaped canisters. Each canister held over 1,000 bats, arranged in special trays to keep them dormant during flight. Attached to each bat's chest was a timed incendiary charge weighing less than 1 ounce. Developed by Harvard chemist Louis Fieser, the same man who created napalm, these miniature bombs were designed to ignite after a set delay, giving the bats time to find cover in Japanese buildings before going off. The delivery system was even more ambitious. Bombers would fly over enemy territory at dawn, dropping the bat-filled canisters from altitude. At a preset height, parachutes would deploy. The containers would open mid-air, and the bats, awakening in the warming light, would scatter across the city in search of dark, enclosed spaces. That's where the horror would begin. Japan's cities in the 1940s were architectural tinderboxes. Wooden homes, paper screens, and crowded neighborhoods made them extremely vulnerable to fire. One bat, roosting in a temple rafter or a factory ceiling, could spark a blaze, 1,000 bats, a firestorm. Compared to conventional napalm or high explosives, the bat bomb promised pinpoint ignition inside structures, fires starting from within, where firefighting was almost impossible. And with no explosions or sirens, the attack would be nearly invisible until it was too late. On paper, the stats looked promising. A B-25 bomber could carry 100 canisters, releasing 100,000 bats in a single run. The bombs had a 15 to 30-minute delay, giving bats ample time to disperse and find shelter. The projected damage, entire city blocks burned before the first alarm was raised. But here came the first red flag. No one could tell the bats where to go. Some flew away. Others refused to leave the canister. A few clung to the bomber as it turned back to base. The team discovered quickly that bats don't follow battle plans. They follow instinct, and instinct doesn't care about your mission. The weapon relied entirely on animals doing exactly what humans hoped, and they didn't. And, still, the army pressed forward. Because while the plan was bizarre, it wasn't the weirdest thing on the table, and in wartime, strange ideas often got their day in the sun. The first phase of Project X-Ray was all theory. The second was all chaos. The U.S. military set up testing operations at Carlsbad Army Airfield in New Mexico, near the massive bat population that had inspired the idea. Engineers constructed holding facilities, bat containers, and high-altitude drop devices. But the minute theory met biology, everything began to unravel. The biggest challenge: controlling the bats. Keeping them in hibernation during transit was essential. If they woke too early, they'd fly off, get confused, or worse, activate the bombs prematurely to maintain their dormant state. Bats were packed into chilled canisters and kept in sub-zero environments until minutes before deployment. But refrigeration isn't a switch. In test after test, bats woke unpredictably. Some flew too soon. Some never left the containers. Others froze to death mid-air. Timing the bomb fuses became a nightmare. The incendiaries needed a delay just long enough to let the bats roost, but short enough to ignite before they were discovered or killed. To make matters worse, the canisters themselves malfunctioned. In one test, the parachutes deployed too late. In another, the trays jammed and failed to release the bats. And when the bats did escape properly, they often flew back toward the base. Then came the disaster. During a live fire test at Carlsbad, several armed bats accidentally escaped their canisters while still on base. Instead of flying toward mock targets, they did exactly what the plan called for. They roosted in buildings, just not Japanese ones. Within minutes, multiple incendiary charges ignited across the airfield. One roosted in a fuel storage shed, another flew into a hangar. Flames erupted. U.S. Army personnel scrambled to contain the fire. An entire hangar was burned to the ground by their own weapon, on their own base. We underestimated the bats' sense of direction, one officer dryly noted in the after-action report. The irony was suffocating. The bats had done exactly what they were supposed to, but not where they were supposed to do it. Worse yet, the entire project was becoming a logistical nightmare. Capturing, transporting, and handling live bats in combat conditions nearly impossible. They needed hibernation chambers on aircraft. They needed fast, high-altitude drops. They needed ground crews trained in zoology and incendiary explosives. And at the center of it all was an unpredictable animal with a 5-gram brain and zero regard for Allied strategy. The dream of a bat-led firestorm was rapidly going up in smoke. By mid-1943, Project X-Ray had moved to Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, where the military built full-scale replicas of Japanese-style buildings complete with wooden walls, paper interiors, and traditional roofing. The goal: test the bat bombs in conditions as close as possible to real Japanese cities. The expectations were high. If the bats performed as planned, they would sneak into crevices, attics, and rafters, turning peaceful buildings into fire traps. The military imagined precision chaos, quiet roosting, followed by synchronized ignition, producing dozens of micro-fires that would overwhelm fire crews and cripple infrastructure. But what actually happened was far from coordinated. In test after test, the bats simply vanished. Many flew in the wrong direction. Some scattered and never returned. Others landed in trees, the ground, or empty fields. The ones that did roost often ignored buildings entirely, seeking out storage sheds, empty towers, or even army barracks. One test observer wrote, "We watched them fly straight into our own observation post. Seconds later, smoke started pouring out." Another recalled, "They didn't land on the targets. They just flew everywhere. One even landed under my Jeep. Even worse, the delayed fuses were wildly inconsistent. Some ignited too soon, setting fires before the bats could roost. Others never ignited at all. On one occasion, a test had to be halted when an entire wave of bats failed to wake from hibernation in time, falling like pebbles from the sky." Still, the military refused to give up. Engineers began experimenting with different species of bats, hoping another type might follow the script more effectively. They tested alternative thermal conditioning to better regulate the bats' sleep cycles. They even redesigned the incendiary bombs, making them smaller, lighter, and supposedly bat-friendly. Nothing worked. Every patch-up attempt introduced new problems. Smaller bombs meant smaller fires. More sensitive triggers caused premature detonations. And the bats, they remained bats, wild animals acting on instinct, not tactics. Meanwhile, the project timeline stretched, costs ballooned, and then came a new development that would change everything. In July 1944, word reached the Project X-ray team that another secret weapon, one far more destructive, had just completed its first test. It didn't use bats. It didn't rely on animal behavior. It was called the atomic bomb. In the end, Project X-ray didn't lose to the Japanese. It lost to a mushroom cloud. In the end, the fatal flaw in Project X-ray wasn't in the engineering, it was in the biology. The bats didn't care about targets. They didn't understand strategy. They didn't follow commands. They followed instinct. And in war, instinct is chaos. The science looked clever on paper, used natural behavior to infiltrate enemy structures and ignite from within. But controlling thousands of living animals mid-flight, across miles of enemy territory, with exact timing and precise positioning, that was fantasy. Worse, the incendiaries relied on timed fuses and a predictable delay after bat release. But in real-world testing, delay times varied wildly. Temperature shifts, altitude, even how long the bats had been asleep, all threw the timing off. A single misfire could trigger disaster, as the Carlsbad base fire had already proved. When compared to the new weapon emerging in total secrecy, the atomic bomb, the Bat Project, began to look like a sideshow, where Project X-ray needed tens of thousands of trained bats, custom aircraft containers, and a flawless biological delivery system. The atomic bomb required one drop and ended cities. A top-secret Army Air Forces memo summed it up best. While effective in theory, the Bat bomb is unnecessary. Developments in long-range explosive payloads have superseded this method. It wasn't that Project X-ray couldn't work. It's that something far more terrifying had already taken its place. Nature, it turns out, doesn't take orders from generals. And when it does, it brings fire in its own way. By early 1944, Project X-ray was quietly canceled. After 2 years of experimentation, $2 million spent, and countless failed tests, the Bat bomb was grounded permanently. No press release, no ceremony, just one more entry on a long list of abandoned World War II wonder weapons. The man behind it all, Lytle S. Adams, didn't go out with a bang. Once heralded as a visionary by friends in Washington, he faded into obscurity after the war. His bizarre invention was later lampooned in magazines and military memoirs as one of the strangest weapons ever proposed. The U.S. Army buried the project in archives, embarrassed by the outcome. After all, the only known structure ever destroyed by the bat bomb was American. That's the twist. The sole confirmed casualty of Project X-Ray was a U.S. airbase hangar, set ablaze by escaped bats that had done exactly what they were designed to do, just in the wrong country. In total, over $30 million in today's money had gone into developing and testing a weapon that never reached the battlefield. Thousands of bats had been captured, frozen, studied, armed, and launched into the sky. And the result, zero damage to the Axis, zero strategic gain, just one flaming hangar and a cautionary tale. Let's break it down: 6,000 bats, 2 years of development, $30 million, and not a single enemy city touched. The bat bomb didn't just fail. It burned itself into history as a perfect example of wartime ambition colliding with the limits of reality. Project X-Ray may have died in a hangar fire, but its strange legacy flew on quietly, and in some surprising directions. Though the bat bomb never reached combat, the research didn't go to waste. The tiny delayed action incendiary charges developed for the bats drew interest from weapons scientists, including those working on napalm deployment. The lightweight ignition system helped pave the way for smaller, more portable fire-starting devices used in later conflicts. Beyond the hardware, the bat bomb became a case study in non-traditional warfare. It was one of the first U.S. attempts to weaponize biological vectors, not disease, but behavior. That line of thinking would later evolve into Cold War research into animals for espionage, like pigeon-guided missiles and dolphin-based naval surveillance. And while the military backed away from weaponized wildlife, the private sector didn't. Some of the biological handling techniques developed for Project X-Ray, like thermal regulation and hibernation induction, were later referenced in zoological studies and early wildlife transport methods. But the clearest legacy, a long, uncomfortable reminder that just because something can be done doesn't mean it should. Here are the 3 hard-won lessons from America's most explosive animal experiment. First, don't outsource warfare to wild animals. Instinct and battlefield precision do not mix. Second, even brilliant ideas collapse under logistical insanity. The bat bomb required entire new logistics chains for a single, unpredictable effect. Third, too weird to work is usually a red flag. If it sounds like science fiction, it probably belongs in fiction. In the end, Project X-Ray was more than a military failure. It was a mirror reflecting just how far desperation can push a superpower during total war. What if Project X-Ray had worked? Imagine dawn breaking over Tokyo or Osaka in 1944. No sirens, no bombers, just silence until, one by one, the city erupts into chaos. Thousands of fires ignite from the inside out. Roofs catch first, then rafters, then entire neighborhoods. Fire crews overwhelmed, civilians terrified. A silent army of bats had turned an entire city into a firestorm before the sun reached its peak. Had the bat bomb been deployed successfully, it could have inflicted massive damage across Japan's flammable, wooden cities without warning, and with no conventional defense. Unlike the slow roar of bomber squadrons, this attack would have been invisible until it was far too late. The psychological effect, devastating. Fear of the unseen, panic over every dark corner, rumors of animals that burned buildings alive. But here's why the failure was a blessing in disguise. If Project X-Ray had succeeded, it could have opened the door to widespread biological weaponization. Other nations might have explored animal-borne explosives, even more grotesque delivery methods. World War II was already brutal. This would have made it bizarrely cruel. In the end, nature was spared the draft, and cities were spared a weapon that belonged more in horror films than in history. A dentist, a dream, and thousands of bats strapped with bombs. This was Project X-Ray, America's strangest attempt to win a war with nature. It promised quiet destruction, urban firestorms, and biological precision. But instead, it delivered a flaming hangar, millions lost, and a spot in history's hall of military absurdities. If you found this story as shocking as we did, hit that subscribe button because next time, we're heading back to Nazi Germany, where engineers tried to build a jet-powered suicide rocket plane. Yes, seriously. And now it's your turn. What's the most bizarre weapon you've ever heard of the pigeon-guided missile, the Panjandrum? Let us know in the comments, because sometimes the wildest part of war isn't who wins, it's what they tried along the way.